Why you think that?
Well, I think that because I believe that neither government and neither major party actually seems to have the interests of the people at heart. They seem to have the interests of their donors, who tend to be the richest and most powerful in society, even more so in America. But I think we're pretty much there in Britain, where the wealthy are driving what is important policy wise, and that what will improve the lives of the ordinary people doesn't seem to be anywhere near top of the agenda. And the only things that seem to rile people up or that governments are willing to talk about is the sort of like identity issues that you sort of referenced are used to great effect and great horrors in places like Africa. Like, I mean, my brain goes to all the different sort of campaigns that I researched while I was writing my first book about Brexit. I was talking about Cambridge Analytica and their sort of campaign tactics and techniques, and that's exactly where they went. Identity, they find the wedge issue, divide people based on this one thing that defines you apparently, and then like make people really angry about it. And Britain seems to fit all of these like definitions basically for me. And I can't tell how dramatic I think I'm being, because obviously like it's easy to sit here in Britain where we still have many freedoms. Like obviously like where the right to protest is being slowly etched away, and you could argue the online safety bill is going to be an imposition on like our freedom of speech, and
Mm-hmm.
there are ways in which those rights are being chipped away. But like I could still like walk down the middle of Downing Street like just with a huge sign that said like "Go fuck yourself, Boris Johnson," and they'd kind of just have to accept it. And if they didn't, there'd be fucking outrage. There wouldn't be someone like rolling along in a little van and like fucking grab me in and being like, haha, we'll never see you again. Or like, you know, we still have a lot of freedoms, but I watched them sort of being etched away, and I watched like the the difference in the application of the system of justice that's very much defined by your net worth. And that's why I tend to think that. But yeah, you've seen more of these regimes than I have. Like, how over dramatic do you think I'm being?
No, I think you've put it well, actually. I think it's very important to remember that there's nothing inherent in any state or society that makes them a democracy or a kleptocracy. It's just a certain set of conditions. And this is a sliding scale. So at one end, let's put Equatorial Guinea. Putin's Russia's not far from that end either, but a country that is completely in thrall to the arbitrary, venal greed of those who hold power and maintain it in the most brutal way. Leaving aside for a second these questions of how they lock into the global economy, just that. And at the other end, maybe bits of Scandinavia, and little spots here and there around the world. Where there are the strongest institutions we've been able to build to safeguard the interests of the many. The rule of law, a free press, and independent representatives of the people in a parliament. It's really those three, I'd say. Now, there's nothing to say that any of those things are immortal. There's nothing to say that they couldn't ever sprout forth in Equatorial Guinea. God knows there are some very brave people trying. Tutu Alicante and people like that. We come to some of these extraordinary characters. But that's, I mean, I suppose so I'm trying to just put a sort of theoretical version of what you're saying. And the only reason those institutions stay strong is if every day individual people opt for the sanctity of that institution over their own private interests when those two things are in conflict. But it can be that, put it this way, my years in Africa, I was in Latin America before that, and I spent a lot of time in the former Soviet Union. I can always come back to this line. There's a Goethe line where he says, "I can't think of a crime I couldn't commit." I think take you or me or anybody, and you put them in the position of my friend George, who lives in the Niger Delta. He's got kids. He knows that he's going to encounter roadblocks. This is the part of Nigeria where all the onshore oil is, and where the oil companies have this kind of grey relationship with armed militias who will occasionally kidnap their oil workers, but also will, do the bidding, do the political enforcement of the political class, who are in this kind of symbiosis with the oil companies and so on. Anyway, George is trying to get by, but he knows that if he's got to get through a roadblock, he's going to have to hand over a bribe. If he wants something from a politician, he's going to have to bribe them. If he wants his kid to get a school diploma, probably have to bribe the teacher. If he wants his kid to get malaria treatment, he might have to bribe someone to get into the hospital. If I was in George's position, I would pay all of those bribes, because otherwise my kid's going to die of malaria or not get an education, or that vital bit of political assistance I need is not going to come. I would do all of those things. I dare say you would. I challenge anyone to say they wouldn't. That's what happens in an oil economy. Now, Obama made a great speech about how Africa needs big institutions, not big men, and that's the key. Like the development of those institutions is the difference essentially between you being born in a country where you have a decent chance of relative freedom and relative protection from arbitrary violence, and living life subject to the daily threat of arbitrary violence. Now, are the UK and the US heading in more in the direction of Sweden or more in the direction of Equatorial Guinea? I think you're absolutely right that they're heading more in the direction of Equatorial Guinea. I think partly that is because for decades now, the West has been absorbing kleptocratic money. So there was this
you made that point really well in that film that I talked about earlier, about that they weren't importing Western values, or like Western values, but you know what I mean. They weren't importing like democratic values.
Well, there was this moment
that we were importing their corrupt values, or the sort of acceptance of corruption.
I think I was paraphrasing a very intelligent guy in the States called Paul Massaro there, and if I've got this right, I'll just continue to thieve it from him. That essentially there's this moment of unbelievable hubris in the late 80s. You go back and read like George H.W. Bush's speeches at the time. It's extraordinary. And Clinton and Blair have this too. So there's this sense of the West has triumphed in the Cold War. Capitalism has triumphed. So we are now going to send this kind of platoon of market consultants and accountants and bankers and lawyers into Russia, but also elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, and the other kind of ex-communist outposts in the Cold War in Africa.
Everyone misses that.
And we're going to just kind of like switch on capitalism, and we're going to remake the world in our own image, as liberal capitalist democracies under the American hegemony. And what we're realizing to our startled horror now is that precisely the opposite was happening. Which is that we were plugging a global capitalist system into ultra corrupt, often oil funded kleptocracies, which have started to remake the Western democracies in their own image. It's really important to remember that, and I know I often fall into this trap, that we're not talking about sort of one kleptocratic country versus one democratic country. We're talking about networks of power generally. So just as there are, fantastically brave Democrats in Putin's gulags in Siberia, so there are energetic kleptocrats in London and New York.
They're just better paid.
They're just much better paid. Yeah. So you see, and that's why I had this idea of kleptopia, is to try to get at these alliances. We talk about a community of democracies. My God, there's a community of kleptocracies. And as I write about in the book, one of the best ways of understanding this is Trump. So again, as we were talking about before, about kind of people appealing to tribal identities, right? That's the rhetoric of the kleptocrat. You strip that away and follow the money. The best advice of American journalism, fine American journalism. What is Trump? Where does he come from? Right? Trump is a kind of brat who inherited a lot of money and wanted to look like desperate. His ego made him desperate to look like a successful businessman. He actually just pissed all his money away. He's incapable of running a successful business. Casinos, property, but they all go bust. It's all there in the records. Right?
Oh yeah,
it's all well known.
Which makes his branding abilities incredibly impressive.
Branding abilities, yeah, but let's dig into that a bit for a second. What do we actually mean by that? Two things happen in the kind of the early noughties that make Trump into what he is. There's this tsunami of dirty money out of the kleptocracies, right? In the 90s, it's the scramble for control. Organized crime, ex-KGB types, kind of the new oligarchs, Russia and the former Soviet Union, scrambling around. A lot of people get killed. A lot of people get very rich. And then they realize, right, we've made a fortune out of this lawlessness. But it is still lawless. So what we want now, for our loot, ironically enough, is the protection of the rule of law. So there begins this tidal wave of money into places where you have the rule of law. The London Stock Exchange, all those big listings, New York property, right? So a lot of these guys are just gangsters. Well, maybe they get called oligarchs, a couple of removes away. And they are legitimizing themselves. We were talking about Nazarbayev doing that earlier. So there's this wall of money, and it's buying lawyers and accountants and peers of the realm sitting on boards, former prime ministers. It's getting, you're getting Gerhard Schröder to lobby for you. And as this tidal wave of money goes out, another thing is happening at the same time, which is the birth of reality television. And these two things coincide in the person of Donald Trump. So he's able to create...
That's quite a Venn diagram.
Yeah. He's able to create... the people who came up with... what was it called, that original? Survivor. The kind of the original big reality TV thing. Kind of like using a kind of bastardized idea of Darwin to try and have this kind of like red in tooth and claw human experience of people just fighting to be king. And then that's turned into a sort of capitalist
version of that. I can't believe we got to Love Island from that, because that's great TV.
Actually, two of my younger cousins made me watch that the other day, and actually you can see the sort of the evil genius dynamics underpinning it. Anyway, but so there's a capitalist version of that, which they call The Apprentice, starring Donald Trump. So he gets to play reality television, the clue's in the name, right? He gets to play the sort of quasi-real business mogul, even though he's a shit businessman. But he actually does need some money, right? He has to have some money because these projects do happen. They do start before they go bust. Big things do get built. And you have, the opening sequences of The Apprentice with helicopter shots of these buildings with Trump's name on it. Yeah. But where's the money coming from? Right, that's part of what I and others started to dig into around the time Trump became president, and that's one of the stories in Kleptopia. It's like, where's all that money actually come from? It's coming from Russia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, and it's astonishing. This meeting of people who've made massive amounts of money in the gangster economies of the former Soviet Union, seeking a legitimate face, seeking to be able to translate that gangster wealth into the wealth of the currency of, the Rockefellers, of a kind of American high society. It's kind of Gatsby transformation, right?
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you want to leave us a comment, that would be awesome. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.